Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on Across the Fence. I'm Jolie Whitney. Today, we're revisiting a discussion with Casey March. She's an end-of-life doula. Traditionally, talking about death is neither comfortable nor easy, but it can be a comfort and easier when you have the support of someone like March to guide you or a loved one through this very human and very inevitable time in everyone's life. What March and end-of-life doulas offer is support and to bear witness to and for the dying and the living. Our conversation about this important topic began with March explaining that even though her work comes at perhaps the most critical time in a person's life, it's healthy and normal to think about the end of life when you've still got a lot of life to live.
So death doulas or end-of-life doulas are really support people. They help people who are at the end of their life or contemplating their end of their life to make plans, identify their values in order for them to have a really well-supported death. That often involves not just the dying person, but their immediate loved ones or caregivers, whoever their circle of care or community of care is.
And when you're working with people, do they often already know what they would like the dying process to look like, or is that something you kind of help them figure out?
It really depends. So some people have a really good idea. I had this one client, we'll call him Tom, who had been a hospice volunteer. His wife had predeceased him and he was her primary caregiver. So he had a lot of experience with the end of life. He knew a lot about what hospice looked like, what services were available. So he had a really clear picture in his mind of what he wanted. And you might think to yourself, then why would someone like that work with a doula? He was in his 90s, his children lived out of state, and so what he was doing is working with me to put together his plan. He had this community of people who wanted to help him, but they didn't really know what to do, and so I was sort of the director of events, if you will. I was helping people identify what tasks they were going to take on, when they were going to be present for him, when he was no longer able to communicate his wishes for himself, who were the point people, and did they know everything they needed to make decisions, right? And so Tom is one type of client, really knew what he wanted, needed help executing. I also work with people who get a diagnosis that's a surprise or just have really not wanted to think about end of life. You can probably imagine that's pretty common. And so when it comes time to make those decisions, they're not really sure. So we do a lot of identifying what their values are so that we can make the decisions based on those values, right? So that they can choose, I want to be treated this way, I want this type of care, these are the people I want to be making decisions for me, this is what I want my bedside vigil to look like. I have a religious faith, I want that involved, or my family might have a strong faith that I'm no longer a part of. I want to make sure that that is honored when I'm not able to speak for myself. So it depends, there's really a spectrum.
And you got training for this from the International End-of-Life Doula Association. Can you tell me what's involved in the training?
Sure. So the training is several hours. It's a combination of working with your instructors. It's live in real time, either online or in person, and with your classmates in breakout sessions, practicing these skills. It is everything from signs and symptoms of dying itself, so people know what active dying looks like, what's totally normal. Families a lot of times don't have a lot of experience with this, and so when a doula is present to say, like, this type of breathing is a normal change, it's part of your respiratory system shutting down, that's very soothing and calming for folks to understand what those are. We're non-medical people, but we understand some of the basics, right? Other tools and skills that we learn are things like guided meditation and imagery. We learn how to help people with putting together legacy and remembrance projects. So that might be something like writing letters to be given to children at important times during their life. Or I had someone who was a musician who played an instrument their entire life, so recording them playing one final time so that that music could be given to people after the fact and incorporated into their memorial service. There's lots of different things. We also learn soft skills like deep active listening, how to be present for someone who is going through something and center their experience. We learn about family dynamics, a lot of really interesting things.
And we were talking about this before the taping a little bit, but this is kind of a second career for you. Can you tell me how you got into this?
Yeah. So my entry into this was a combination of personal experiences and sort of what happened in 2020. My grandmother had passed in February of 2020, so before COVID was really front and center for us in the United States, but she had passed in the ICU, and so that was a very sterile experience. And a difficult one for my family. Not that we didn't know it was coming, but just felt really unprepared in some ways. And I didn't know doulas existed. I didn't know that there was an option like that that could have been a support. Then 2020 rolls around, I lose another friend in a hospital that I wasn't able to visit, right? Not to COVID, but to something else, and just couldn't see her. I knew many people who lost someone during 2020. And so all of a sudden I was thinking about this more and more. And I heard about end-of-life doulas. And I was like, oh, this is the gap. This is the thing that we need. It's not necessarily the medical piece. It's some of that like social, emotional, practical support when you just don't know about dying. You just don't know how to walk through this process, right? Like we have other milestones in life, the birth of a child or weddings, where we sort of have scripts, we have ceremonies, we have things that we do, but this felt really different.
And death doulas are something that's kind of easy to conceptually understand, but can you walk me through kind of what the day-to-day operations are?
It really depends on the day. So some days if I'm working with a client for, let's say, a planning visit, I might go to their home, wherever they are, and we'll sit down for an hour or two, depending on their energy level and what works for them, and work on whatever their agenda is for the day. Perhaps it's creating a legacy project and we're working on that activity. Or I might be working with a client and their family during vigil. So vigil is when someone is actively dying. And when I am there, I am really making sure that the vigil plan that we put together is being honored, and that I am continuing to hold this sacred space, that I am being a support for the family. The client shifts a little bit at that point from the person who is actively dying to that person and their circle of care, right? And so really taking care of them and helping to support them. It is a combination of sort of the practical hands-on. Is everyone being fed? Are things taken care of? Who needs to be called when? Where are those phone numbers? But also that emotional and social support. This is what's normal. It's okay. Letting people have their emotions and be present in that moment.
And you mentioned the family a little bit. What advice do you have for a family who has a loved one working with a death doula?
Yeah, I think that it's important for families to ask questions, right? Like, we don't know a lot about this. We don't talk about death at dinner parties and what our wishes are and things like that. So it is okay to be intimidated or scared or curious and to ask doulas questions. What do you do? How did you get into this work? How can I show up in these particular ways? It's an opportunity to talk to somebody who is not intimidated by these conversations, who doesn't think your questions are morbid or anything like that. So I think it's a real opportunity for people.
And can you tell me, do end-of-life doulas charge for their services? Do some doulas work pro bono? What's the range?
Yeah, so there are a combination. Some doulas work purely pro bono, and there is a lot of feeling in this field that nobody should be prevented from working with an end-of-life doula because they don't have financial means. So even doulas who charge often offer sliding scale services or do some pro bono work. I myself, I run a business, and so I do work privately with clients one-on-one who pay me, but I'm also a hospice volunteer and I do pro bono work and I offer sliding scale. So both are available to folks. It depends on what is an option in your region. There are some people who volunteer through hospices and are hired as not hired, but are volunteers as doulas. So it depends on what's available in your region, what kind of training opportunities are available for people who are doing this work.
And is it covered by insurance at all for some people?
No, so because doulas are non-medical, health insurance doesn't cover it yet. There have been some sort of conversations about birth doulas potentially being covered, and that has the death doula community kind of interested in paying attention and seeing, well, how would that play out, and is that something that we might advocate for ourselves too? But it doesn't exist yet.
And what is the best way to find the right end-of-life doula?
Yeah, so there are different search engines online that offer listings of death doulas. So one of them is NEDA, which is the National End-of-Life Doula Alliance. That is a company that doesn't offer any training itself, but it certifies doulas, and anybody can go online and say, I've taken my training, do their certification process and get listed on their website. All of the different training organizations also tend to hold lists of people who have done their training. And so when you Google end-of-life doula or death doula, you'll get a list of various websites. And NELDA will be one of them. UVM will be one of them. My recommendation is to do the location-based searches, find a couple of people in your area, make some phone calls, and then interview folks, just like you would for any other service you were having someone come into your home to do, to find out who's the best fit for you.
And you mentioned hospice a little bit earlier. Can you kind of talk about the relationship between a doula and maybe a hospice program?
Yeah, so I like to think of us as being on the same team, right? And when I talk about a client's community of care, hospice is often a part of that community. So folks don't have to be on hospice to work with a doula. honestly, I even work with people who, so in order to be on hospice, you have to have a terminal diagnosis of 6 months or less. It's one of the requirements of the hospice program. As a doula, I can work with someone at any stage, right? So somebody might get a diagnosis and be very early on, not close to death at all, but they want to make plans, and that's okay. I don't have that limitation. So I start working with them then, and we might do some work for, a couple of weeks, not talk for quite some time. Then it's time to enroll in hospice, and they reach out again for some additional supports. So we're all different members of the team. Hospice provides a lot of really amazing services, and doulas can sort of be there and fill in different gaps or different needs that the family really wants to focus on.
And can you tell me maybe about the family side after the death? Do you provide grief counseling at all?
Yes. So it's not counseling per se, but what we do is I am trained to provide reprocessing. So if I am there for the death itself, helping people who have also witnessed the death kind of go through their day and process it a second time so that they can make meaning of the experience for themselves. I also do early grief work with folks, so talking to them about what is totally normal in grief, what might be challenging, and then I help folks if they want a referral to a clinical resource, if they want to see a social worker or a therapist or someone like that to do longer term grief work.
And we're almost out of time, but could you quickly tell me about the Northeast Death Doula Network? You're involved with the community. Can you tell me what they provide?
Sure. So the Northeast Death Doula Network is for doulas in the New England region and New York, and it's really a professional development community. So it is a space for end-of-life doulas to connect with their peers, to share expertise, to gain new knowledge. It's an online community, so members meet once a month. They have access to discussion boards where they're able to ask questions and sort of work through things that are challenging them in their work. We have guest speakers come in and talk to us about different topics, green burial, people who like to do body care at home after a funeral. We talk about that, different things that are changing in the law and might be really interesting and that doulas want to know about so that they can talk to clients about what they might be interested in. We also offer community resources, and so it's really a supportive place for folks to connect with peers, find community themselves, talk about this work with others who are interested, because some people like to talk about death, but not everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was great meeting you.
And my thanks to the crew behind the scenes here at WCAX who helped make this program possible. I'm Jolie Whitney. Have a good one.